Hello and welcome to 18 WJTS in.form. I'm your host, Bill Potter. We are honored once again to have in the studio with us Jan Dougan, the Health and Human Sciences educator with Purdue Extension. And Jan, we learn a lot of different things when we talk to you. And today we're going to talk about processed food, which is something we've talked about before. But what's processed food?
So processed foods are foods that it's not a whole food anymore. Someone or something has done something to them or changed up the food. And you know, when we've talked about it before, we caution people about processed food intake because there's so much sodium in processed foods, and that's where we get a lot of our sodium from, and we want to try to help people reduce their sodium intake. But it's sort of gotten a bad rep, you know, when we think about processed foods, because when we think processed foods, what do you think, Bill? Processed foods, name one.
Well, for me, canned green beans.
Okay, so that's a processed food. Potato chip, processed food. Whole wheat bread, processed food. Bagged spinach, processed food. So something has been done. We haven't gone out and taken that right from the garden, you know. So a processed food is something that has happened to that food. So I have a list with me of different kinds of processing that happens to food. So there are minimally processed foods. So like that's that bagged spinach or cut vegetables, or if nuts are roasted. And those things are healthy. You know, we think of those things are healthy. It's just been pre-prepped for our convenience. And you know, when you think about that, that's a great thing to use if you're more likely to have nuts as a snack. If they're roasted, you know, good for you, because that's a good and healthy snack. Or if you're using spinach for your salads, but you like that's pre-packaged, pre-washed, ready to use, and you're more likely to use it, then that's great. There are also processed foods that, you know what, because they process them, let's talk about frozen vegetables. That's a processing, but they're frozen at their peak nutritional value. And they are just like if we're eating fresh because of the way that they do that today. So the process that they use today. So a frozen vegetable is a processed food. And then we have foods that have added flavor or added texture or colors or preservatives or oils, like pizza sauce or pasta sauce or salad dressings or yogurts or cake mixes. And you know what? A number of those foods are okay foods to eat. In fact, I believe all foods are okay to eat. It's just that in moderation and how much we eat of it and when we eat it. So we just have to rethink branding processed foods as not good foods for us to have.
That's a good point, because whenever you think processed, I always say, well, we don't want, that's processed, that's too much processed. But to me, bologna, which I love, is processed food, but that's highly processed. But you know, you wouldn't think about that bag of spinach as being processed. So processed food is good, but I'm glad you brought up the different kinds of processed foods.
And the reason some processed foods are good for us is because they're nutrient dense. And I mentioned the vegetables, the frozen vegetables. That would be an example. Some of the processed foods, like milk, is a processed food. Or juices that have been fortified with calcium or vitamin D, or breakfast cereals that fiber has been added to them. That's an okay food to have. Canned fruit packed in water or in its own juice is a good option when the fresh fruits aren't available, or when they don't look so great in the grocery store and you still want that at home. So think about those foods that are minimally processed, such as the pre-cut vegetables or the bagged spinach, and their convenience for food that people are really busy, and you know, they might do the drive-through rather than do a salad if they didn't have that type of processed food. So what I want to encourage people to think about is just think about the choices that you're making, and that processed foods aren't always the bad guy, but we have to think about what foods are our better options, what foods are our better choices.
Well, I mentioned green beans. You asked me about a processed food. Green beans, processed, but you can rinse. There are things you can do to those foods to take away some of, not the detriments, I don't mean to put it that way, but they've got too much sodium in them because that's the way they have to pack them. So you can rinse them.
Right. So any canned food product that if you want to use it, and it will work and not change the product or the content of the product, then you could rinse it in a colander with cool running water and rinse away some of the sodium content. We also need to look for those processed foods. So we need to look for the processed foods that have more sodium. We need to look for the processed foods that have more sugars. And some of those sugars are hidden in the foods, like some of those cereals in the breakfast aisle. You know, you might think it's a healthy choice, but when you really look at that nutrition label on the box of cereal, you realize how much sugar has been added to that food. And you know, we don't want to have a lot of added sugars in our daily diet, and we don't want to have a lot of sodium in our daily diet. So those are two things we need to watch, and processed foods are sources of those two things. So let's all become nutrition label readers. Mm-hmm. Let's look at that label. Let's look for the sugars. Let's look for the sodium. And if you don't understand about the grams on the nutrition label, let's look at the daily value. The daily value is a percentage on the label that will tell you how much of your daily percentage of sodium or sugar is in that food.
Well, and there's other little things, iron, potassium, vitamin B12, different things that you need are in a lot of the processed foods, and they label it that way.
Right, right. So you know, think too about, why am I eating this food? You know, what is this doing for my body? What is it good for? We know we need calcium every day, especially as we age. We need that for bone health. So, you know, if milk is a great source of calcium, you know, that's your source of calcium. So you want to be sure that you have that every day and enjoy that every day. We just need to be more aware of the foods that we're selecting, what's in those foods. We need to be label readers, and we need to be aware of what we're choosing and choose foods that we can cut our sugar intake, our added sugar intake, and our sodium intake.
Probably 90% of what we eat is processed somewhere.
Well,
unless we're growing the tomatoes ourselves out in the yard, but we only do that in the summer. Mm-hmm. But probably 90% or better is processed, but it's not that bad.
Right.
Yeah. Just
and that's the
be
message
conscious of it.
That's it. That's the message we want to get across.
All right, Jan, thank you very much for coming in.
Okay, thank you.
We have talked about processed foods with Jan Dougan, who is the Health and Human Sciences educator with Purdue Extension. If you have a question about that, give Jan a call and she can give you some more information about it. She's always available, too, to come and talk to your group, your social organization about topics that you might be surprised that if either you or somebody at the office can talk about.
Yeah, if you think about raising kids, eating right, spending smart, living well, any of those topics, we probably have a program or a talk that we can do for your group or organization.
Just give them a call, 812-482-1782, or call the extension agents in your area.
Sure.
Because it doesn't have to be Du Bois County, it can be Spencer County, Warwick County, whatever.
Yeah.
All right. Jan, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching WJTS in Form. We're local people watching local people.